Welcome back to Alberta Primetime, and on tonight's focal point, Occupy Calgary and Edmonton, part of the global revolt against corporate greed. Will it accomplish anything? We'll ask our panel tonight. Jane Alm is an investment advisor with Angus Watt Advisory and National Bank Financial. Shafik Hirani is a director and senior executive financial advisor with Investors Group Calgary. And Beth Hamilton-Keene is a director and portfolio manager with Moore Investment Management. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to Alberta Primetime.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Jane, Alberta protesters are joining the Occupy Wall Street action. Do people, do you think, in the public understand exactly what it is that they're protesting?
I think there's many different things that they're protesting. I think some people are protesting the corporate greed. I think there's a lot of young people that are protesting the fact that, look, they're educated, they've paid for educations, and they can't get jobs. They're at points where there's no jobs to be had in some sectors, especially if you're a teacher in some of those areas. And I think they're protesting that fact as much as anything. But I think there's many people out there who are just protesting, and they're not really quite sure exactly what the cause is, but they know that it's something that they want to be active about.
Right, and perhaps that might hurt the whole thing. But Beth, even if the point is somewhat muddled, should Albertans, should people anywhere in the world necessarily dismiss, if it's a problem, rich getting richer? I mean, super rich, and so many individuals at the same time struggling.
Absolutely, we shouldn't dismiss it. We're definitely seeing that with the deleveraging that we're going through, which is really kind of the peak of the leveraging was in 2008, 2009. We still have a long way to go to bail ourselves or dig ourselves out of this trench and this hole. We've managed to kick the can down the road per se, but we haven't really dealt with the problem. And so what you're going to be seeing is a lot of unhappiness and unrest with the lack of job creation opportunities, the lack of wealth creation opportunities for the majority of people. And part of that is the deleveraging, and part of that is some of the inequality that we're seeing.
When you say deleveraging, what does that mean? Managing through the recession, companies trying to get by?
Managing through the recession, but just really the growth that we had over the last decade or more is based on debt. It's based on leveraging, and we're now needing to unwind that.
Right.
And in fact, right now, we're going to be faced with looking at the protests perhaps could have an influence on governments who have so far been unwilling to act and unable to act from a political willingness standpoint.
I actually did want to get to that more specifically, but first, Shafik, let me ask you to put the problem, while we're talking about the big picture, put it into perspective for us. Is it less acute in Alberta, say, than other places like the States? And this started on Wall Street. It's really picked up steam in Europe. Are we somewhat immune to it here because of our strong economy?
Yeah, it is a little bit less acute in Alberta than it is in the States, just because of the growing disparity gap between the affluent and the masses and the poor. However, as an Albertan, we got to be very cautious, because there's been a lot of reports about Alberta's debt, and it can very quickly turn into a problem in Alberta. Mm-hmm. The challenge becomes there's a lot of regulatory framework in organizing this deleveraging that Beth was talking about, and even that could cause a decline in growth for Albertans.
The provincial debt, certainly a hot political topic. Jane, narrowing the gap between high income and low income, also something that fiscal and tax policy makers have long considered, maybe not done a whole lot about. But should this be something that our provincial government, if not Ottawa, deals with much more aggressively, both for itself and society in general?
Well, the issue that you have is that people, at least in countries in the Western democracy, have always been rewarded for hard work. They've been rewarded for innovation and for development of different products.
So how do you take that away?
So do you really want to take that away and take the incentive for that innovation away? So you've got to bear that in mind. Should everyone pay their fair share of taxes? Absolutely. That doesn't mean necessarily that somebody who earns a large salary should pay more, significantly more, to make up for those that aren't. But they definitely need to pay their own. Maybe close some of the loopholes that exist. Maybe that's an easier way.
Because even the financial tycoon in the States, Warren Buffett, said, I pay less in percentage-wise, I pay less taxes than my secretary, my executive assistant, which seems wrong.
It is, and that's where those loopholes come in. There's write-offs that people in the very wealthy get that others can't qualify for.
Beth, would more regulations on business help the wealth gap, or just hurt and dampen the economic environment and corporate incentive? Because I think what we're ultimately asking is, you know, we saw the political unrest in Egypt and Libya and Yemen. We saw that actually accomplish something where everyday people said enough. So now if you've got these protests spreading throughout the world of everyday people, for the most part, saying we're tired of this inequity, we're tired of corporate greed, could they actually accomplish anything?
Well, from a regulator standpoint, it's got to be a careful balance, because if you go too far in one direction, you'll hurt the economic recovery, and if you go too far in another direction, we may end up with a socialization of finance or tax on financial transactions or other things like that. So you've got to be very careful with that, and it really comes back down to where is the inequality, how can it best be fixed, and how can you move forward with it. From a financial standpoint, we're looking for a return to fiduciary responsibility and behavior on behalf of the organizations and financial institutions in which we're investing in.
Right. Well, we'll see how this proceeds. We'll see if it grows, and we'll see if politicians and policymakers start paying attention in a real way. Next, why our banks are drawing up their own wills, exit plans for disaster. The Monday Money Panel returns in a moment here on Alberta Primetime. Welcome back to Alberta Primetime and the Monday Money Panel. If you use a major bank, did you know it is likely planning for its own demise? Big banks are creating their own living wills, drafting exit plans for a financial catastrophe. Shafik, Beth, either one of you care to weigh in on why this is happening?
Well, I think the old plan wasn't working as good as the new plan might. They need a regulatory infrastructure. The old plan used to be pay your executives a lot of money. Step 2, tell the government you're broke. Step 3, call the central banker and say you're too big to fail. And step 4, get the money. Yeah.
And now the governments are running out of money, so the bailout option no longer exists. So banks are now forced to deal with how will they plan for their own potential demise. The only problem that I see with this is it may lead to unfounded confidence in what the exit strategy might look like if the demise were to end up happening. I think that it can't possibly cover all the potential consequences, and it may give this unfounded confidence that's probably not fully deserved.
And the timeline is very short too. The Financial Services Board want to complete this within 1 year, and we're talking about who's going to cover the expense. The central bankers to come up with this regulatory framework across countries is a very significant expense for something that we're not even sure is going to work correctly or not. So.
And we often think Canadian banks were safe. They're very conservative, well-run. However, they are part of this process. It's actually fairly formal. The G20, group of the world's 20th large economies, agreed last year to work together to make cross-border bank failures easier to handle. The Financial Stability Board, a global group of regulators and central bankers, come up with a detailed plan, please, and give it to us for the next G20 meeting in Cannes in November. So that's what they're scrambling to do, and we're watching, you know, all of these banks and governments fail around the world and cause all of us incredible grief for our SPs at the very least. Jane, are they learning anything about themselves through this process, even our stable Canadian banks?
Well, I think they're getting a much better handle on where their risks really are. They're also getting a much better handle on where their assets are, and their assets being people, where they can do things to manage those risks, what they can put in place a little more easily. As Beth was pointing out, it's great to put these plans in place, but you don't know whether you're even going to be able to execute until the time happens, because if you're saying you're going to sell X division, there still has to be a buyer for it.
You don't know what the disaster is going to look like.
You can guess, but it's a guess.
So to a certain extent then, I guess, Beth, even Canadian banks have some global exposure. Would this have any impact on customers at all, or is it strictly them making sure they're stable?
Well, right now it's an exercise in how stable are they and what did things look like. And it's certainly one of the other things that they're learning is their interconnectedness in terms of within the country and externally with some of the other areas. Of course, analysts have been doing this work and trying to do this work for quite some time. It will always be that constant effort to try and understand what the risks of any business are, Canadian banks included. So let's not be too shy about this. Every business has a risk, and we have to understand. And that risk is certainly going to be changing and morphing with the world climate in which we're existing and morphing. To me, a much more important note is what are we as individuals doing along the same lines? In terms of planning for that, fire drill or that emergency that you haven't planned for. It's the same exercise we need to go through as individuals.
Shafik, anything to add on that? Is there the individual risk? Is there risk with financial services, businesses that we might be dealing with, or is it strictly, as Beth says, something that we need to look at internally?
I think there is a little bit more risk to the individual, I believe, than Beth does, because, again, going back to the cost infrastructure to implement this framework, it's expensive, and the bank's got to pull that money from somewhere. I think that somewhere is not going to come from the shareholder, because the bank has a duty to make their shareholders money, so it's going to come from the retail consumer of the banks. The consumer either will get less of a dividend or will have to pay more fees in their banking, day-to-day banking, to make up for this cost of this framework. So I think it will impact all of us.
There's probably don't forget our
Go ahead.
Our dependents. Don't forget our dependents. This is one of our largest sectors in Canada in terms of even investments and within our portfolios. So that's an important piece to consider as well. And
just last point, just really quickly, is that I think it's going to create a lot of animosity, and it is towards the banks in general. So I think it's not really the best case scenario right now.
Final thoughts?
I would agree with that. Banks in Canada do make up a large percentage of most people's portfolios, and with what we've seen even with the Occupy Wall Street, there's a lot of anger against the banks already. We don't need to make it worse.
Thank you very much, everybody. Great thoughts tonight. Jane Alm is an investment advisor with Angus Watt Advisory and National Bank Financial. Shafik Hirani is a director and senior executive financial advisor with Investors Group Calgary. And Beth Hamilton-Keene, a director and portfolio manager with Moore Investment Management.